March 1941. A Victorian mansion in the English countryside converted into Britain's most closely guarded secret. In a small cottage on the grounds of Bletchley Park, a 19-year-old woman stared at a message that shouldn't exist. Every letter of the alphabet appeared in the encrypted text before her. Every letter, that is, except one. The letter L was missing entirely. Most people would have dismissed it as coincidence, perhaps a quirk of the Italian language, or just random chance in the chaos of wartime communications. But Mavis Lever wasn't most people, and in that single missing letter, she saw something that would change the course of naval warfare in the Mediterranean, send 5 enemy warships to the bottom of the sea, and prove that sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come not from mathematical genius or technological superiority, but from understanding one simple truth. People make mistakes, even in war, especially in war. This is the story of how a seamstress's daughter with a talent for German poetry became one of the most important codebreakers of World War II, and how her ability to spot human error in the supposedly perfect machinery of the Enigma cipher helped win one of the Royal Navy's most decisive victories since Trafalgar. But before we dive into that fateful day in March, we need to understand who Mavis Batey was, and how a young woman from South London ended up holding the keys to enemy secrets that generals and admirals would have given fortunes to possess. Mavis Lillian Lever was born in May 1921 in Dulwich, London, about as far from the corridors of military power as you could imagine. Her mother was a seamstress, her father worked for the postal service. They lived in Norbury, a modest neighbourhood where people worked hard, kept their heads down, and didn't expect their daughters to end up as pivotal figures in world-changing events. But Mavis was bright, exceptionally so, and she had a gift for languages that her teachers couldn't ignore. She attended Coloma Convent Girls' School in Croydon, where she excelled in her studies, and by 1939 she'd won a place at University College London to study German. She was 19 years old when war broke out, sitting in lectures about German romantic poetry, while the very real threat of German bombers loomed over London. As she later recalled, "I was concentrating on German romantics, and then I realised the German romantics would soon be overhead, and I thought, well, I really ought to do something better for the war effort." So she volunteered. She imagined herself as some kind of glamorous spy, perhaps seducing Prussian officers for information. But as she ruefully admitted later, "I don't think either my legs or my German were good enough." Instead, the government code and cipher school had other plans for her language skills. At first, her war work was decidedly unglamorous. She was assigned to check the personal columns of the Times newspaper, searching for coded messages that enemy spies might be using to communicate. Day after day, scanning advertisements for lost cats and requests for gentleman companions, looking for patterns that might reveal hidden meanings. It was tedious work, the kind that would drive most people to distraction. But Mavis had patience, and more importantly, she had an eye for patterns. Someone noticed. In May 1940, still just 19 years old and with absolutely no formal training in cryptography, Mavis was summoned to a place she'd never heard of, Bletchley Park. The Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire had been requisitioned by the British government and transformed into the nerve centre of the Allied code-breaking effort. Here, some of the brightest minds in Britain were gathered with one impossible mission: break the German Enigma cipher. She was taken to a small cottage on the grounds, away from the main mansion, where she met a man who would change her life. Alfred Dillwyn Knox, known universally as Dilly, was already a legend in British intelligence circles. During the First World War, he'd worked in room 40 at the Admiralty, where he'd helped decrypt the Zimmermann telegram, the intercepted German message that had helped bring America into the war. Between the wars, he'd been a distinguished classics scholar at Cambridge, an expert on ancient Greek papyri. He was eccentric in that particularly British way, absent-minded and brilliant, the kind of man who would forget to invite his own brothers to his wedding, which he actually did in 1920. Knox's greeting to the nervous teenager was typically unconventional. "Hello, we're breaking machines. Have you got a pencil? Here, have a go." He handed her some papers covered in letters and numbers. Mavis looked at them, completely baffled, and replied honestly, "It's all Greek to me." Knox laughed. "I wish it were," he said. Greek, after all, was something he understood perfectly. This was something far more complex. Knox had a preference, some said an innocent one, for recruiting young women to his code-breaking team. His group became known around Bletchley as Dilly's Girls, or sometimes with typically British humour, Dilly and his fillies. The women he chose, Margaret Rock, John Perrin, and now Mavis Lever, weren't selected because they were mathematicians or trained cryptographers. They were chosen because they could think laterally, spot patterns, and had the language skills to recognise when something in a message didn't quite fit. Knox himself was a linguist, not a mathematician, and his approach to breaking Enigma reflected that. While others at Bletchley were developing complex mathematical theories and building computational machines, Knox relied on intuition, language knowledge, and what he called rodding, a technique that used linguistic patterns and educated guesses to break into new cipher systems. To understand what Mavis and her colleagues were up against, you need to understand what made the Enigma machine so formidable. Imagine a typewriter connected to a series of rotating wheels or rotors, each one scrambling the alphabet in a different way. When you pressed a key on the Enigma keyboard, an electrical current would flow through these rotors, bouncing through them in a complex path determined by their positions and wirings, and then light up a different letter on a display board. That scrambled letter was your encrypted character. But here's where it got truly diabolical. Every time you pressed a key, the rotors would step forward to new positions, changing the encryption pathway for the next letter. This meant that pressing the letter A 5 times in a row would produce 5 completely different encrypted letters. It was a polyalphabetic substitution cipher of extraordinary complexity. The military versions used by Germany had additional features, a plug board that swapped pairs of letters before they even reached the rotors, and a reflector that sent the current back through the rotors in reverse, ensuring that the encryption was reciprocal. If A encrypted to Q, then Q would encrypt to A. This was convenient for operations, but, as we'll see, it also created a fundamental weakness. The number of possible settings on a military Enigma was astronomical. With 3 rotors chosen from a set of 5, each rotor having 26 possible starting positions, and the plug board creating billions of additional combinations, there were roughly 150 trillion possible configurations. The Germans believed, with considerable justification, that Enigma was unbreakable. Even if the enemy knew exactly how the machine worked, the engineering behind it, they couldn't possibly try every combination to decrypt a message. It would take years, decades even. By the time you broke yesterday's messages, the war would be over, but the Germans had made one critical assumption, that their operators would use the machines perfectly, following procedures exactly, never taking shortcuts, never getting lazy, never making the kind of small human errors that seemed insignificant but could be fatal. The Italians, Germany's ally, used a version of Enigma that was actually slightly simpler. The Italian Navy employed commercial Enigma machines without the plug board, making them somewhat easier to attack than the full German military versions. Knox had worked on these machines during the Spanish Civil War, when both Germany and Italy were supporting Franco's nationalists. He'd developed his rodding technique specifically for these machines, using known words or phrases, what cryptanalysts called cribs, to work backward and figure out the rotor positions. When Italy entered the war in June 1940 on Germany's side, Italian Navy Enigma traffic suddenly became a priority. If Britain could read Italian naval communications, they could protect convoys to Malta and Egypt, intercept Italian supply ships heading to North Africa, and anticipate attacks by the Italian fleet. But there was a problem. The Italians had made changes to their procedures and introduced new rotors. The methods that had worked during the Spanish Civil War weren't producing results anymore. For months, Knox's team worked on the problem. He instructed his assistants to use rodding with various cribs, trying to find a way into the new system. They tried perks, using the Italian word per, meaning for, with X as a word separator. After 3 months, there was nothing. No breakthrough, no progress. Then Mavis made her first significant contribution. Going against orders, she extended her cribbing attempt beyond the specified length and found that one message produced personal, Italian for personal. It wasn't a complete break, but it confirmed something crucial. The Italians were still using the same basic machine and procedures they'd used before. The challenge was figuring out the wiring of the new rotor they'd introduced, and this is where dummy messages come into the story. When there wasn't much actual traffic to send, radio operators were sometimes instructed to transmit dummy messages, meaningless text designed to prevent enemy analysts from identifying patterns in when real messages were sent. In theory, a good dummy message should look like random text, indistinguishable from real encrypted communication. In practice, lazy operators often took shortcuts. One day in March 1941, a dummy message arrived at Bletchley Park, intercepted from Italian Navy communications. It had been sent following the introduction of the new rotor, so it was encrypted with the system they were trying to break. Mavis Lever, now gaining confidence in her pattern recognition skills, began examining it. She wrote out the letters, looking for anything unusual, any hint that might give her a way in, and then she saw it. The message contained every letter of the alphabet. Every single one. Except L. 25 letters were present. One was missing. L. Now, if you were generating truly random text, or even if you were writing actual Italian words, having every letter except one represented would be remarkable but possible. But something about it bothered Mavis. She thought about the Enigma machine, about its keyboard layout, about operators who might be bored or in a hurry or just lazy. And then it clicked. The letter L was in the bottom right corner of the Enigma keyboard. If an operator had been told to send a dummy message and decided to take the easiest possible shortcut, they might simply press the same key over and over again, just hold down L and let the rotor scramble it into apparent randomness. But here's the crucial thing about Enigma. Because of how it was designed, because of that reflector that sent current back through the rotors in reverse, no letter could ever encrypt to itself. If you pressed L, you could get any letter except L. So if an operator pressed L repeatedly, the encrypted output would contain every letter of the alphabet except the one letter they were actually typing, L. It was a brilliant deduction, the kind of lateral thinking that Knox valued in his recruits. But recognizing the problem wasn't the same as solving it. Knowing that the plaintext was all L's gave them a crib, but they still needed to work out the rotor positions and wirings to actually break the cipher. Mavis realised she needed help, specifically the kind of mathematical expertise that Knox's cottage didn't specialise in. So she walked over to Hut 6, where German Air Force and Army Enigma messages were being attacked using more mathematical methods. She needed, as Knox had once described them, one of the clever Cambridge mathematicians. The person she found was Keith Batey, a young mathematician who'd come to Bletchley from Cambridge. She explained what she'd found, the missing L, her theory about the lazy operator, what it might mean for breaking the new rotor. Keith immediately grasped the significance. Together they set to work. Using Mavis's crib, knowing that the entire message was just repeated L's, they could use rodding techniques combined with mathematical analysis to work backward through the encryption, determining how the rotors must be wired and how they must have been positioned. It took intense concentration and hours of calculation, but eventually they had it. The wiring of the new Italian Navy rotor was solved. The cipher was broken. Knox's team could now read Italian Navy Enigma messages, but they had no idea just how consequential that breakthrough was about to become, because at that very moment, the Italian Navy was preparing a major operation that would decide control of the Mediterranean Sea. The ability to read their messages was about to change everything. Late March 1941 saw British fortunes in the Mediterranean at a critical juncture. The Germans were preparing to intervene in Greece after Italy's disastrous invasion had stalled. British convoys were desperately trying to supply Greek and Commonwealth forces, sailing from Alexandria through waters that Italian naval forces could dominate if they chose to act decisively. The Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, was a formidable force. Their ships were fast, modern, well-armed. They had the battleship Vittorio Veneto, brand new and powerful, sporting 9 15-inch guns. They had heavy cruisers, destroyers, the infrastructure of a major naval power. What they lacked was the one advantage the British now possessed. The British could read their mail. On March 25th, messages began flowing through Bletchley Park from Italian naval communications. They were decoded using the breakthrough Mavis and Keith had achieved just days earlier. The messages revealed something stunning. The Italian Navy was planning a major sweep south of Crete to intercept British convoys. They detailed which ships were sailing, their intended course, their objectives. One message in particular caught the attention of Knox's team. It read, in decrypted form, "Today's the day -3." It was a countdown. Something major was happening in 3 days. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, commander of the British Mediterranean Fleet, received the intelligence from Bletchley Park. He now knew the Italian plans before some Italian officers knew them. He knew their strength, their route, their timing. It was every naval commander's dream, perfect intelligence on enemy intentions, but he also faced a challenge. If he acted on this intelligence too obviously, if he sailed out to intercept them in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, the Italians would know their codes were broken. They'd change their procedures, improve their security, and the advantage would be lost. So Cunningham engaged in a bit of theatre. He made sure he was seen going ashore in Alexandria with a suitcase, as if planning to spend the night at a hotel. Italian spies watching the port would report that the British admiral was ashore, that the fleet wasn't preparing for immediate action. Meanwhile, his ships were quietly preparing to sail. At Bletchley Park, Knox's team worked around the clock for 3 straight days. They decoded every Italian message they could intercept, building a complete picture of the Italian operation. Ships were identified by name, courses were plotted, times were confirmed. When Cunningham's fleet sailed to intercept, they knew where to go with a precision that seemed almost supernatural to the Italian commanders who would soon face them. The British force included 3 battleships, HMS Warspite, HMS Valiant and HMS Barham, veterans of countless engagements. They had the aircraft carrier HMS Formidable, whose planes would prove decisive. They had cruisers and destroyers, a powerful force but one that still faced considerable Italian strength. The encounter began on the morning of March 28, 1941, off the coast of Crete near Cape Matapan. British cruisers made contact with Italian forces, and the daytime phase of the battle saw aircraft from Formidable attack the Italian battleship Vittorio Veneto. A torpedo struck the battleship's outer port propeller, reducing its speed and forcing Admiral Angelo Iachino, the Italian commander, to make a fateful decision. Rather than continue the operation, he decided to withdraw toward the Italian mainland. His fleet would return to port, but the withdrawal would have to happen at night, and this is where the British advantage became overwhelming. British ships were equipped with radar, a technology the Italians lacked entirely. In the darkness, British vessels could see Italian ships as clear electronic blips, while the Italians had only their eyes and whatever moonlight happened to be available. As night fell, 3 Italian heavy cruisers, Fiume, Zara, and Pola, accompanied by destroyers, found themselves in terrible danger without realizing it. The heavy cruiser Pola had been hit by a torpedo during the day's air attacks, and was stopped in the water, her crew attempting repairs. Iachino sent Fiume and Zara, along with 4 destroyers, back to help their stricken sister ship. It was an act of naval honour, refusing to abandon a wounded vessel, but it would prove fatal. Admiral Cunningham's battleships, alerted by radar, closed in on the Italian force. The Italian ships had no idea the British were approaching. Their night fighting doctrine was virtually non-existent. Their main gun batteries were actually disarmed, not ready for action, because Italian procedures didn't anticipate night combat. At 10:20 p.m, the British ships were just 3,800 yards away, point-blank range for battleship guns, when the Italian cruisers finally spotted what they thought were friendly vessels. Then the British searchlights blazed on. Among the officers manning those lights was young Prince Philip, the future Duke of Edinburgh, serving aboard HMS Valiant. The sudden illumination revealed the Italian cruisers in perfect detail, caught completely unprepared. What followed was devastation. The British battleships opened fire with their massive guns. 15-inch shells weighing nearly a ton each slammed into the Italian cruisers from murderously close range. British gunners reported seeing entire turrets, the armoured housings for the Italian guns, blown dozens of metres into the air by the force of the explosions. The heavy cruiser Fiume was destroyed in the first 3 minutes of the engagement. She sank at 11:30 p.m. Her sister ship Zara fought on longer, but was crippled by the barrage and finally finished off by a torpedo from the destroyer HMS Jervis at 2:40 a.m. on March 29th. 2 Italian destroyers, Vittorio Alfieri and Giosuè Carducci, were caught in the maelstrom. They tried to fight back, firing at shadows in the darkness, but they were overwhelmed in the first 5 minutes. Both destroyers were sunk with heavy loss of life. The crippled Pola, the ship whose distress had drawn the others into the trap, was found by British destroyers later that night. Some 200 of her crew were still aboard, having initially abandoned ship but then returned in confusion. A prize crew was sent over, the Italian sailors were taken off, and Pola was sent to the bottom by British torpedoes. When dawn broke on March 29th, the scale of the disaster became clear. The Italian Navy had lost 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers in a single night action. Approximately 2,400 Italian sailors had perished, most from Zara and Fiume. The British losses: 1 torpedo bomber and its 3-man crew shot down during the day's aerial attacks, 1 aircraft, 3 men, against 5 warships and 2,400 sailors. It was the most one-sided naval victory since Trafalgar. The Battle of Cape Matapan, as it came to be known, broke the Italian Navy's confidence completely. They would never again attempt a major operation against the British Mediterranean fleet. The psychological impact was as devastating as the material losses. Italian commanders knew they'd been ambushed, but they couldn't understand how. How had the British known where they'd be? How had they been waiting in exactly the right place? The Germans suspected, correctly, that British intelligence had penetrated Italian communications, but the Italians remained largely in denial about the security of their ciphers. At Bletchley Park, the codebreakers experienced something rare in their secret war: immediate, visible results from their work. Usually they broke codes and sent intelligence to commanders, never knowing what happened next, never learning if their efforts had made a difference. The Official Secrets Act bound them to silence, and the need for operational security meant they were told nothing about how their intelligence was used. But the Battle of Cape Matapan was different. A few weeks after the engagement, Admiral Cunningham himself visited Bletchley Park. He came to personally thank Dilly Knox and his team of young women codebreakers for making his victory possible. For the codebreakers, who spent their days and nights in windowless huts, staring at endless streams of encrypted letters, never seeing the war they were fighting, this recognition was extraordinary. Cunningham told them their intelligence had been perfect, complete, absolutely vital. Without it, the battle might not have happened, or worse, might have happened on terms favourable to the Italians. These young women, these girls as they were patronisingly called, had achieved what all the military academies and naval traditions couldn't: perfect intelligence that led to perfect victory. Dilly Knox, the eccentric classic scholar who'd recruited these brilliant minds, was moved enough to write a poem celebrating the victory. Knox wrote poetry throughout his life, and this one included a stanza specifically honouring Mavis's contribution. When Cunningham won at Matapan by the grace of God and Mavis, nigro simillima signo est, praise heaven, a very rara avis. The Latin phrase meant, like the black swan, she is, praise heaven, a very rare bird. For a 19-year-old woman who'd started the year checking newspaper advertisements for hidden codes, it was extraordinary recognition. Mavis later recalled it as very heady stuff for a 19-year-old. Admiral John Godfrey, the Director of Naval Intelligence, summarised it perfectly when he told Knox, "Tell Dilly that we have won a great victory in the Mediterranean, and it is entirely due to his girls. Not partly due, not assisted by, but entirely due." In the male-dominated world of 1940s military intelligence, this was remarkable acknowledgement of what women could achieve when given the opportunity and the tools. But Mavis's contribution to the war effort didn't end with Cape Matapan. In fact, her greatest breakthrough was yet to come. In December 1941, just 8 months after Matapan and still only 20 years old, Mavis tackled what many considered an impossible problem: the Abwehr Enigma. The Abwehr was German military intelligence, and they used a variant of the Enigma machine that was considered even more secure than the standard military versions. The Abwehr Enigma had 4 rotors instead of the usual 3, giving it exponentially more possible configurations. It also had additional turnover notches, making it step through positions in a less predictable pattern. Cryptographers at other sections of Bletchley Park, including the brilliant mathematicians in Hut 6, had concluded it was unbreakable, or at least not worth the effort required to break it. But Knox disagreed, and he put Mavis on the problem along with another of his recruits, Margaret Rock. They worked together using Knox's linguistic methods combined with careful analysis of message traffic. Then came a breakthrough, a message intercepted between Belgrade and Berlin that Mavis managed to decrypt. The contents of the message itself weren't as important as what the successful decryption revealed about the machine's internal wiring. They'd figured out how the rotors were connected. The supposedly unbreakable Abwehr Enigma was broken. Knox was so impressed with the work of Mavis and Margaret Rock that he made his famous classical reference, "Give me a lever and rock and I can move the universe," playing on Archimedes' famous quote about levers and fulcrums. The breaking of the Abwehr Enigma would prove absolutely crucial to the Allied war effort, though its full importance wouldn't be clear for years. The intelligence gained from reading Abwehr communications formed a vital part of the double-cross system, the British operation that turned captured German spies and used them to feed false information back to Berlin. Before D-Day in 1944, the double-cross system convinced the Germans that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. German forces were positioned based on this deception, and when the Allies actually landed in Normandy, the Germans hesitated to send reinforcements because they believed the Normandy attack was a diversion. Reading Abwehr Enigma traffic allowed British intelligence to confirm that the Germans believed the false information they were being fed. They could see that the deception was working. This knowledge gave Allied commanders confidence to proceed with D-Day, knowing the Germans were looking in the wrong direction. Mavis Batey's work on Abwehr Enigma, achieved at age 20, contributed directly to the success of the largest amphibious invasion in history. During her time at Bletchley Park, working those long days and nights on the Italian and German ciphers, Mavis fell in love. Keith Batey, the Cambridge mathematician who'd helped her solve the lazy operator problem back in March 1941, became more than a colleague. They married in November 1942, two brilliant minds who'd been brought together by the accident of war and the necessity of breaking codes. They would remain together for the rest of their lives, Keith passing away in 2010 and Mavis in 2013. After the war ended in 1945, the work done at Bletchley Park disappeared into official secrecy. The codebreakers were bound by the Official Secrets Act and told to never discuss what they'd done. For decades, the veterans of Bletchley Park went on with their lives, carrying incredible secrets, and the world had no idea. Mavis spent some time in the diplomatic service, then devoted herself to raising her 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. But her brilliant mind needed occupation beyond domestic life, and she found it in an unexpected field: garden history. She became one of Britain's leading experts on historic gardens and landscape design, authoring numerous books on the subject. She served as secretary and later president of the Garden History Society, campaigned to save historic parks and gardens from destruction or inappropriate development. Her work was so influential that she received the Veitch Memorial Medal in 1985 and was made a member of the Order of the British Empire in 1987, both honours for her contributions to garden conservation. People knew her as a garden historian, an author, a conservationist. They had no idea she'd helped win the war. It wasn't until 1974, nearly 30 years after the war's end, that the British government began to lift the veil of secrecy around Bletchley Park. Frederick Winterbotham's book, The Ultra Secret, revealed for the first time that the Allies had been reading German Enigma traffic throughout the war. Even then, specific details about who did what remained classified. Gradually, over the decades that followed, more information emerged. Veterans of Bletchley Park, released from their oaths of secrecy, began to tell their stories. Historians started piecing together the full picture of what had been accomplished in that Victorian mansion and its surrounding huts. Mavis's role in breaking Italian Navy Enigma and Abwehr Enigma became known. She was recognised as one of the leading codebreakers at Bletchley Park, not just one of the leading female codebreakers, but one of the very best of either gender. In 2009, Mavis wrote a biography of Dilly Knox titled Dilly, the Man Who Broke Enigmas. It was both a tribute to her mentor and a first-hand account of the code-breaking operation she'd been part of. The book revealed details of the work at Bletchley that had remained secret for more than 60 years. She advised Kate Winslet during the filming of Enigma, the 2001 film about Bletchley Park codebreakers, sharing what it had been like to be one of the few women in that secret world. Historians sought her out for interviews and documentaries. The woman who'd spent decades being known for gardens and landscapes was finally recognised for her contributions to one of history's most important intelligence operations. When Mavis died in November 2013, at the age of 92, obituaries around the world celebrated her remarkable double career. Bletchley Park Trust historian Michael Smith described her as something special, noting that what she did was absolutely critical at various points of the war. So what can we learn from Mavis Batey's story? First, that intelligence, real intelligence, often comes from unexpected places. The 19-year-old daughter of a seamstress and a postal worker achieved what trained military cryptographers and university mathematicians couldn't. She had no formal training in code breaking. She hadn't studied mathematics at Cambridge like so many of her male colleagues. What she had was pattern recognition, linguistic intuition, and the ability to think like her enemy, to imagine the human being on the other end of that cipher machine, tired or lazy or just taking a shortcut. Second, that the small things matter. A single missing letter in a dummy message. A lazy operator pressing the same key repeatedly because he couldn't be bothered to type random text. These tiny human errors, meaningless in themselves, became the cracks through which entire cipher systems could be broken. The Germans and Italians believed in their machines, in the mathematical security of billions of possible settings, but they forgot that humans operate the machines and humans make mistakes. Third, that success in war, and perhaps in life, often depends on seeing what others miss. Hundreds of messages pass through Bletchley Park every day. Hundreds of people read them, analysed them, attempted to break them. But it was Mavis who noticed that one letter was missing, who made the leap to understanding what that meant, who turned an observation into actionable intelligence. And finally, that history is full of unsung heroes whose contributions were hidden by classification, by sexism, by the simple fact that secret victories can't be celebrated. For decades, Mavis Batey was just another retired woman, known for her books on gardens. But she'd helped turn the tide of the Mediterranean War, contributed to the success of D-Day, saved countless lives by shortening the conflict. The story of Bletchley Park reminds us that wars aren't just won on battlefields by soldiers with guns. They're won in quiet rooms by people with pencils, by those who can spot the pattern others miss, by individuals who understand that the most sophisticated machine in the world is still only as reliable as the humans who operate it. Mavis Batey looked at a message where one letter was missing and saw the human behind the machine. She saw the tired operator, the shortcut taken, the vulnerability created. And in that moment of insight, 5 warships were already sailing toward their fate, though no one knew it yet. That's the power of intelligence, both the kind you gather and the kind you're born with. If you enjoyed learning about this incredible woman and this fascinating piece of World War II history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Ignis Tempora for more deep dives into the stories history forgot to tell. And let us know in the comments, what other unsung heroes from World War II would you like to hear about? Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember that sometimes the greatest victories come not from strength or numbers, but from simply paying attention.